The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. November 14, 1944. Somewhere between Metz and the German border, the road that had existed 12 hours ago was gone, blown into a canyon of mud and twisted metal by German demolition teams. The craters were still smoking, water pooling in the deepest holes like black mirrors reflecting the gray dawn. A German reconnaissance officer, watching through binoculars from a hillside bunker, allowed himself a thin smile. This would slow the Americans for at least a week. Maybe 2. Time enough to fortify the next defensive line, time enough to prepare more surprises. But then he heard it. A low rumble that wasn't thunder. Through the mist and rain came headlights, not 1 or 2, but dozens. Bulldozers. Graders. Dump trucks loaded with gravel. And behind them, an endless convoy of machinery that seemed to stretch back to the horizon. The officer lowered his binoculars, his smile fading. Within 4 hours, the road would be rebuilt. Within 6, American tanks would be rolling across it. He would radio this back to headquarters, and they wouldn't believe him. They never did. Not until they saw it themselves, the impossible pace at which the Americans could erase destruction itself. This is the story they don't tell you about World War II. Not the battles or the generals or the grand strategies, but something far more terrifying to the German high command, an army that could build faster than they could destroy. An industrial hurricane that turned bomb craters into highways overnight, that filled chasms while enemy observers watched in disbelief, that made the very earth itself surrender to American engineering. Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe to keep these stories alive. The numbers are staggering even today. Between June 1944 and May 1945, American engineer battalions built, rebuilt, or repaired over 45,000 miles of road across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. That's nearly twice the circumference of Earth. They did it under fire, in winter storms, through minefields, while exhausted beyond human limits. They did it so fast that German intelligence reports from late 1944 contain passages that read like horror stories. The enemy's ability to maintain supply lines defies conventional military logic. Roads destroyed at sunset are operational by dawn. Lieutenant Klaus Brenner, stationed near Aachen, wrote to his wife in October 1944. Yesterday we destroyed the bridge at Eschweiler. We used 200 kilograms of explosive. The satisfaction lasted exactly 9 hours. This morning I watched American engineers throw a temporary bridge across the gap like they were laying a tablecloth. The trucks never stopped coming. It's like fighting the tide itself. But to understand how this happened, we need to go back to the beginning. June 1944. The beaches of Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in human history had just succeeded, but now came an even greater challenge: how to supply an army of millions across an ocean, through a destroyed country, all the way to Berlin. The Germans knew this. Their entire defensive strategy after D-Day relied on a simple calculation: destroy the infrastructure faster than the Allies could repair it. Blow every bridge. Mine every crossroad. Crater every mile of asphalt. Turn France into a logistical nightmare that would strangle the Allied advance in its own success. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had told Hitler himself. Let them land. Let them come. They'll advance 50 miles and stop, choking on their own supply lines. An army without roads is just a mob with guns. He was half right. An army without roads is indeed crippled. What he didn't understand was that the Americans had brought their own roads with them. The first sign came within hours of D-Day. Even as paratroopers were still fighting in hedgerows and infantry was pushing inland from the beaches, specialized engineer units were already at work. They had trained for 2 years in Britain and the United States, not just in combat engineering but in something unprecedented: high-speed construction under fire. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion could build a timber trestle bridge in 4 hours. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion could lay a mile of quarter road, logs placed side by side over swamps, in 6 hours. These weren't rough paths. These were roads that could support 30-ton Sherman tanks and endless convoys of 2.5-ton trucks. Captain James Morrison of the 146th Engineer Combat Battalion described it decades later. "We had one job: keep the army moving. Didn't matter if the Germans blew a bridge at noon. By sunset, we'd have something across that gap. Maybe not pretty, but it would hold. We called it good enough engineering. It didn't need to last 100 years, just long enough to win the war." The Americans had industrialized road construction in a way the world had never seen. They brought entire quarries worth of equipment: D7 bulldozers that could push aside destroyed tanks like toys, graders that could level a road surface in one pass, specialized trucks that could lay metal matting, pierce steel planks, at a rate of 100 yards per hour. They brought mountains of supplies: prefabricated bridge sections, Bailey Bridge components that could span 240 feet, millions of sandbags, endless tons of gravel and crushed stone. Most importantly, they brought something the Germans hadn't anticipated: an entire culture built around speed and efficiency, formed in the highways and construction sites of Depression-era America. These weren't just soldiers. They were men who had built the Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel. They were road crews from Texas, bridge builders from Pennsylvania, construction workers from Chicago. They brought with them not just muscle but institutional knowledge: how to read soil, how to drain water, how to make something solid out of nothing but mud and determination. Sergeant Roy Dunham from Arkansas remembered, "The Germans would blow a crossroads to hell. We'd show up with our dozers and in 2 hours have it graded flat. 3 hours, we'd have gravel down. 4 hours, traffic would be moving. The German prisoners we'd captured would watch us work, and you could see it in their eyes. They knew they'd lost the war right there. Not in battle, but watching us fix in hours what took them days to destroy." The evidence lies in the German communications themselves. By August 1944, intercepted radio messages show increasing desperation. A Wehrmacht engineering officer near Chartres reported, "Destroyed the N-154 highway bridge at 0200 hours. Americans had temporary bridge operational by 0800 hours. Recommend allocating more explosives for complete destruction." The response from headquarters was telling. "No additional explosives available. Make do with what you have." But the Americans weren't just rebuilding roads, they were improving them. French civilians would go to sleep with their local road a cratered moonscape and wake to find it transformed into a 2-lane highway, complete with drainage ditches and road signs in English. Marie Du Bois, who lived near Carentan, wrote in her diary, "The Americans work like men possessed. They don't sleep. All night we hear the engines, see the lights. They build roads the way others breathe, constantly, without thinking, as if their very existence depends on it." In a way it did. General Dwight Eisenhower understood something fundamental: in modern mechanized warfare, logistics was everything. An armored division without fuel was just expensive scrap metal. Infantry without ammunition was just tired men with rifles. The German army, for all its tactical brilliance, was still largely horse-drawn. The American army ran on wheels, and wheels needed roads. The Red Ball Express, the famous supply convoy system that kept the Allied armies fueled and fed, depended entirely on these rebuilt roads. From August to November 1944, trucks ran 24 hours a day on designated highways, delivering 400,000 tons of supplies to the front lines. The convoy never stopped. When German aircraft strafed the roads, engineers would fill the craters before the smoke cleared. When German saboteurs blew bridges at night, temporary spans would be in place by morning. The Germans called it der Rote Ball Albtraum, the Red Ball Nightmare. Here's where the story takes a darker turn. By September 1944, German military doctrine had shifted. If they couldn't stop the road building, they would make it lethal. Support this work so the truth continues to reach people. Subscribe and share. The Germans began using delayed action mines, explosives with timers that would detonate hours or even days after being planted. They booby-trapped the rubble of destroyed bridges. They mined the obvious detour routes. They targeted the engineers specifically, knowing that killing the road builders was more effective than destroying the roads. On September 28, 1944, near the Siegfried Line, The 291st Engineers were rebuilding a crucial junction when the ground erupted. The Germans had buried aircraft bombs 10 feet deep, with timers set for 36 hours after their retreat. 11 engineers died instantly. 20 more were wounded. The crater was 60 feet wide. The other engineers, some still covered in their friends' blood, had the road operational again in 8 hours. Private First Class Anthony Valdez from New Mexico was there. "We didn't even stop to process what happened. Couldn't afford to. Every hour that road was closed meant some rifle company up ahead wasn't getting ammunition. So we just kept working. Filled in the hole where our buddies had been. That's what they would have done for us." The German response grew increasingly desperate. They began destroying roads that had no military value, just to slow the Americans down. They blew up farmers' lanes, village streets, paths that had existed since Roman times. It didn't matter. The Americans rebuilt them all, and usually better than before. A German intelligence report from October 1944 noted with something approaching panic. "Enemy engineer capability exceeds all pre-war estimates by a factor of 10. Recommend immediate revision of defensive planning to account for impossibility of creating lasting infrastructure damage." But the real psychological warfare was the speed. German soldiers would spend days preparing demolitions, carefully placing charges, running detonation wires, timing everything perfectly. They would blow a bridge or road section and retreat, satisfied they had bought their comrades time. Then they would learn that American vehicles had crossed that destroyed obstacle within hours. It broke something in them, this relentless pace of American construction. Colonel Heinrich Müller, captured near Metz, told interrogators, "You have to understand what it was like. We were the Wehrmacht. We had conquered France in 6 weeks. We had driven to the gates of Moscow. But you Americans, you did something we couldn't understand. You made our destruction meaningless. Every bridge we dropped, every road we cratered, it was like punching water. The shape returned instantly." The engineers themselves were pushing beyond human limits. They worked in shifts that lasted 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours straight. They dozed standing up, leaning on their shovels. They ate while operating bulldozers. They developed a condition the medics called road fever, a state of exhaustion so complete that men would continue working while essentially unconscious, their bodies running on muscle memory alone. Technical Sergeant William Harper from Ohio collapsed after working 52 hours straight on a bridge near Bastogne. When medics tried to evacuate him, he fought them off with a wrench, insisting the bridge wasn't finished. It took 3 men to carry him to an aid station. He was back working 6 hours later, against doctor's orders. "The infantry needed that bridge," he said simply when asked why. The machinery was pushed just as hard. Bulldozers ran until their engines seized, were rebuilt on site, and pushed forward again. Trucks drove until their tires dissolved, running on rims when necessary. The Americans had anticipated this. For every bulldozer at the front, 2 more were being repaired just behind the lines. For every truck that died, 3 more were already sailing across the Atlantic. It was industrial warfare at a scale that beggared imagination. The Germans tried everything. They felled giant trees across roads. The Americans had specialized tank dozers that could push aside entire forests. They flooded valleys by destroying dams. The Americans built elevated causeways in days. They created avalanches in mountain passes. The Americans carved new roads into the cliffsides. There was no obstacle that couldn't be overcome, no destruction that couldn't be repaired, no delay that lasted more than hours. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann, an engineering officer in the German 7th Army, wrote in his journal, "Today I watched American engineers repair the bridge at Prum. We had used shaped charges at every support, dropped the entire span into the river. It took us 3 days to destroy it properly. The Americans had it passable in 14 hours. I counted their engineers. There were perhaps 60 men. 60 men did in 14 hours what it would take us a week to accomplish. I begin to understand that we are not fighting an army. We are fighting a machine, and machines don't tire, don't fear, don't stop." But perhaps the most telling moment came in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive, Their last desperate gamble depended on speed. They needed to capture Allied fuel dumps, race to Antwerp, split the Allied armies. They had planned every detail, including massive demolition of roads behind their advancing forces to prevent Allied reinforcement. It was a brilliant plan with one fatal flaw: they had calculated based on normal engineering capabilities, not American ones. When the German offensive began on December 16th, they immediately destroyed bridges and roads behind their spearheads, expecting this would buy them days or weeks. Instead, American engineers, working in blizzard conditions with temperatures below zero, rebuilt those roads so fast that Allied reinforcements reached the battlefield ahead of German schedule. The 101st Airborne reached Bastogne using roads the Germans thought they had eliminated. Patton's Third Army swung north on highways that, according to German maps, no longer existed. General Otto von Manschufel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, said after the war, "We knew we had to move fast. What we didn't know was that the Americans could build faster than we could advance. We would capture a position, destroy the roads behind us to prevent counterattack, and then discover American tanks approaching on those same destroyed roads within days. It was militarily impossible, yet it happened." The weather during the Battle of the Bulge was the worst in decades. Temperatures dropped to -20. Snow drifts reached 6 feet. The ground froze so hard that explosives barely dented it. Yet the American engineers kept building. They mixed antifreeze with concrete. They melted snow with flamethrowers to make aggregate. They laid steel matting over ice and somehow made it hold 30-ton tanks. They worked with bare hands when gloves made them too clumsy, losing fingers to frostbite but never stopping. One story from that December has become legend among military engineers. The bridge at Orthoville was destroyed by retreating German forces on December 19th. The span dropped into the river, which was running high with winter melt and chunks of ice. The approaches were mined. German artillery had the position zeroed. Every engineering manual said it would take minimum 3 days to bridge that gap under those conditions. Master Sergeant Jake Bernstein from Brooklyn looked at the destroyed bridge, at his exhausted men, at the convoy of tanks waiting to cross. He said 5 words that his men would remember forever. "Fuck it! 4 hours, boys!" They did it in 3 hours and 40 minutes. They worked under constant artillery fire. They lost 2 bulldozers to mines. 4 men died when a temporary span collapsed. But at 0340 hours on December 20th, the first American tank rolled across the Orthoville Bridge. The German observers couldn't radio the news back immediately. They refused to believe what they were seeing. Headquarters would think they were drunk or hallucinating. The engineers had developed techniques that seemed like magic to outside observers. They could throw a Bailey bridge across a 60-foot gap in 90 minutes, the metal sections clicking together like a giant erector set while under fire. They had perfected the combat trail, a rough road that could support military traffic, built at a rate of a mile per hour. They used bulldozers in pairs, one cutting and one filling, choreographed like a ballet of steel and diesel. They developed the instant road, pierced steel planking that could be rolled out like a carpet, creating a temporary highway in minutes. But the most impressive feat was coordination. Building a road wasn't just about moving dirt. It required surveying, drainage, foundation work, surfacing, marking. The Americans had turned it into an assembly line that moved forward across Europe. One unit would clear obstacles. Another would grade. A third would lay foundation. A fourth would surface. A fifth would mark and maintain. They moved like a single organism, each part knowing exactly what to do without orders. French historian Marc Blanc wrote, "The Americans brought to war the same principles they had brought to automobile manufacturing: standardization, specialization, and above all, speed. They turned road building into a kind of violent efficiency that was terrifying to observe. It wasn't construction so much as conquest by infrastructure." By January 1945, the German High Command had essentially given up on infrastructure denial. A captured order from this period reads, "Destruction of roads and bridges will continue as resources permit, but units should not depend on such measures to significantly delay enemy advance." American engineering capability must be considered unlimited for planning purposes. Unlimited. That was the word they used. The German General Staff, the same organization that had invented modern military doctrine, had essentially admitted that American engineering capability exceeded their ability to calculate or counter. They might as well have been fighting gods who could reshape the earth at will. The stories from early 1945 grow almost surreal. Engineers building bridges while standing waist-deep in freezing water. Bulldozer operators working by touch in fog so thick they couldn't see their own blades. Entire roads built in total darkness to avoid German artillery spotters, the engineers working by feel and instinct. Roads that German commanders swore were impassable swamps in the evening would be carrying American armor by dawn. Captain Ernst Richter, a German intelligence officer, wrote a report that survived in Allied archives. The American capacity for construction has become a weapon more devastating than their bombers or artillery. They advance not by destroying our positions but by simply building around them, over them, through them. They make the terrain itself irrelevant. In all our planning, in all our calculations, we never imagined this. We prepared for an enemy that would fight us. Instead, we face an enemy that simply erases the battlefield itself and replaces it with roads. The numbers from the final months are staggering. In March 1945 alone, American engineers built or rebuilt 8,000 miles of road. That's equivalent to a highway from New York to Los Angeles, twice. They did it while advancing, while under fire, while managing prisoners, while coordinating with advancing infantry and armor. They built 17 major bridges across the Rhine in a single week. They laid enough pierced steel planking to cover 600 football fields. And the Germans watched it happen, helpless to stop it. Luftwaffe pilot Hermann gets described flying over American positions. From the air, it looked like an infection spreading across the land. Brown earth turned to white roads, spreading in every direction like veins. Every day the infection spread further. We would bomb a section, and within hours it would be white again. It was like watching a time-lapse film of fungus growing, except each tendril was a road carrying American tanks toward Berlin. The human cost was enormous. The U.S. Army engineers suffered over 3,000 killed and 10,000 wounded in the European theater. These weren't just combat casualties. Men died from exhaustion, from accidents with heavy machinery, from working themselves literally to death. They died building things that would be destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, rebuilt again. They died so that trucks could move, tanks could advance, supplies could flow. But they also left something unprecedented. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the American engineers had built or rebuilt nearly 60,000 miles of road across Europe. They had constructed 2,500 bridges. They had laid 100 million square feet of steel planking. They had moved 50 million cubic yards of earth. They had done it all in less than a year, under constant fire, in the worst weather in decades. German General Walter Model, before his suicide in April 1945, wrote a final assessment. We were not defeated by American tanks or planes or infantry. We were defeated by American bulldozers. They buried us under roads. The legacy runs deeper than just military victory. The Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe, was possible because the infrastructure already existed, built by engineers in olive drab, working around the clock while bullets flew overhead. The autobahns that Germany is famous for? Many stretches were rebuilt or improved by American engineers in 1944 to 45. The bridges that still span European rivers? American Bailey bridges, some still bearing faint U.S. Army markings. But there's a darker legacy too. The speed, the efficiency, the relentless pace, it changed warfare forever. Wars were no longer won just by destroying the enemy but by building faster than they could destroy. The lesson wasn't lost on military planners. Every major military since has emphasized combat engineering, rapid construction, the ability to create infrastructure under fire. The highways of South Vietnam, the roads across Kuwait and Iraq, the forward operating bases in Afghanistan, all echoes of what American engineers did in Europe. Subscribe so these forbidden stories don't vanish again. Because this story, this incredible feat of human endurance and engineering prowess has been largely forgotten. We remember D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of concentration camps. But we forget the men who made it all possible, the engineers who built roads faster than the enemy could destroy them, who turned rubble into highways, who conquered not through destruction but through construction. Private First Class Michael Sullivan from Boston, one of the last surviving combat engineers from the European theater, said in a 2010 interview, "People ask me what I did in the war. I tell them I built roads. They look disappointed, like that's not real combat. But I was in combat every single day. My weapon was a bulldozer. My ammunition was gravel and steel planking. And we won that war one road at a time, one bridge at a time, one impossible engineering feat at a time." Today, if you drive through the French countryside, through Belgium, through the German Rhineland, you're likely traveling on roads that were built or rebuilt by American engineers in 1944 to 45. They look like ordinary roads now, worn asphalt, faded lines, unremarkable bridges. But if you know where to look, you can still find the signs. A Bailey Bridge panel used as a fence. Pierced steel planking repurposed as a barn wall. Concrete abutments with dates stamped in them. December 1944, January 1945, March 1945, marking the relentless advance of American engineering. Locals still tell stories. In the village of Houffalize in Belgium, destroyed in the Battle of the Bulge, old-timers remember the Americans rebuilding the main road in a single night. "We went to sleep in ruins," one elderly woman recalled. "We woke up to the sound of trucks. The road was back. It was like a miracle, except the miracle workers were covered in mud and looked like they hadn't slept in weeks." Near Remagen, where the famous Ludendorff Bridge was captured, farmers still find pieces of steel matting when they plow their fields. Each piece weighs 90 pounds and bears the stamp, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers 1944. They use them for fence posts now, these remnants of the greatest engineering feat in military history. The German military archives contain thousands of reports, all variations on the same theme. Road destroyed at 0600. American traffic observed using rebuilt road at 1400. Bridge demolished successfully. Temporary American bridge operational within 6 hours. Extensive mining of crossroads completed. Americans cleared and rebuilt intersection in 4 hours. Reading them in sequence is like watching a slow-motion nervous breakdown of the German general staff, their disbelief turning to alarm, then to desperation, and finally to a kind of resigned awe. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German blitzkrieg tactics, wrote after the war, "We invented mobile warfare, but the Americans perfected it. We thought mobility meant moving fast. They understood it meant building fast. We raced across Europe on existing roads. They built new Europe as they advanced. In the end, they didn't defeat our army. They simply erased the battlefield conditions our army needed to exist." There's a photograph in the National Archives that captures the whole story. It's dated March 24, 1945, taken near Oppenheim on the Rhine. In the foreground, German POWs sit on the muddy ground, watching. In the middle distance, American engineers are building a pontoon bridge across the Rhine. The bridge is nearly complete, it had taken them 10 hours. In the background, endless columns of American vehicles wait to cross. But it's the expression on the German prisoners' faces that tells the story, not defeat, not anger, but something like awe mixed with incomprehension. They're watching the impossible happen again. One of those prisoners, Corporal Hans Becker, was interviewed years later. "We had been told Americans were soft, that they couldn't handle hardship, that they would break against German discipline and determination. Then I watched them build that bridge. They worked like machines, but machines that could think, adapt, improvise. One of their bulldozers broke down. They had it running again in 20 minutes. A section of bridge didn't fit. They modified it with acetylene torches while it hung from a crane. They never stopped, never slowed, never seemed to doubt they would succeed. That's when I knew the war was truly over. You can't fight an enemy that rebuilds the world faster than you can destroy it." The last German attempt at large-scale infrastructure denial came in April 1945, As American forces approached the National Redoubt, the mythical Alpine fortress where Nazi leadership supposedly planned to make their last stand. German engineers had prepared massive demolitions, entire mountainsides rigged to create avalanches, valleys prepared for flooding, every bridge and tunnel packed with explosives. It was meant to create an impassable barrier, a fortress made of destroyed terrain itself. It failed completely. American engineers had become so proficient that they were clearing obstacles almost as fast as the Germans could create them. They had developed techniques for everything: shaped charges to clear avalanches, instant causeways for flooded valleys, portable bridges that could span seemingly impossible gaps. More importantly, they had developed an institutional confidence that no obstacle was insurmountable. Young lieutenants would look at destruction that should have stopped an army and simply say, "Okay, boys, let's get to work." The end came not with a bang but with exhaustion. By late April 1945, German forces had essentially run out of explosives. They had blown up everything they could: every bridge, every crossroads, every culvert, every piece of infrastructure that could possibly slow the American advance. None of it had worked. The Americans just kept coming, their engineers filling every crater, bridging every gap, building roads across the corpse of the Third Reich. On May 7, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, American engineers were still building. They had advanced so fast that some units didn't receive word of the surrender for hours because they were too busy laying roads to check their radios. Master Sergeant Tom Edison, his real name, impossibly enough, of the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion remembered. "We were halfway through a bridge when someone said the war was over. We looked at each other, shrugged, and finished the bridge. Seemed wrong to leave it half done." In the immediate aftermath, as journalists and historians rushed to document the war, the engineers' story was largely overlooked. It lacked the drama of combat, the clear heroes and villains of battle narratives. How do you make a movie about building roads? How do you create dramatic tension from logistics and supply lines? The engineers themselves didn't help. Most were too exhausted to talk, and when they did, they downplayed their achievements. "We just did our job," was the common refrain. But the Germans knew. In the extensive debriefings of German officers conducted by the Allies after the war, one theme appears repeatedly: shock at American engineering capability. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring said, "I can accept that American industry outproduced us. I can accept that American air power dominated the skies. But what I cannot accept, what still seems impossible, is that American engineers could build faster than we could destroy. It violates everything I thought I knew about warfare." The statistics, when finally compiled, seemed impossible even to the Americans who had achieved them. The average combat engineer battalion in Europe moved 10,000 cubic yards of earth per day, enough to fill 4 Olympic swimming pools. They built bridges at an average rate of 1 every 36 hours for 11 straight months. They laid enough steel planking to pave a road from London to Moscow. They did it all while suffering casualty rates comparable to infantry units. Yet for decades, their story remained untold, buried in military archives and technical reports. The engineers went home, back to construction sites and highway departments, taking their incredible story with them. They built the interstate highway system with the same relentless efficiency they had shown in Europe. They revolutionized American construction, applying lessons learned under fire to peaceful purposes. But they rarely talked about what they had done. It wasn't until the 1990s, as the World War II generation began to pass away, that historians started to understand the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Military theorists studying the Gulf War's rapid advance suddenly realized it had precedent. The thunder runs into Baghdad, the rapid construction of forward bases, the ability to maintain supply lines across vast distances, it all traced back to what American engineers had learned in Europe. Modern military doctrine now considers combat engineering as important as artillery or air support. The ability to shape terrain, to create or deny infrastructure, to build faster than the enemy can destroy, these are now recognized as war-winning capabilities. Every major military power has studied what American engineers did in 1944 to 45, trying to understand how they achieved the impossible. But perhaps the most profound legacy is psychological. The American engineers in Europe proved that construction could defeat destruction, that building could be more powerful than bombing. They showed that with enough determination, skill, and resources, any obstacle could be overcome, any destruction could be repaired, any impossible task could be accomplished. They literally rebuilt the battlefield as they advanced, imposing their will not through violence but through sheer creative force. Today, military engineers train on the same principles developed in Europe: speed, adaptability, persistence. They study the bridge at Remagen, the roads through the Ardennes, the impossible engineering feats that made victory possible. But they also study something harder to quantify: the spirit that drove men to work until they collapsed, to build while under fire, to never accept that something couldn't be done. That spirit was captured in a motto that appeared, unofficially, among engineer units in Europe. We build for victory. Not fight for victory, not destroy for victory, but build. It was a fundamentally American idea, that you could construct your way to success, that creation was more powerful than destruction, that the future belonged to those who could make things rather than break them. The last surviving members of those engineer battalions are nearly all gone now. But their legacy lives on in every military operation, every humanitarian mission, every disaster relief effort where American engineers arrive and begin the impossible task of building in the face of destruction. The DNA of those World War II engineers, their refusal to accept defeat, their ability to innovate under pressure, their sheer stubborn determination to keep building no matter what, has become part of American military culture. In 2018, the last known reunion of World War II combat engineers was held in Washington, D.C. 17 men attended, all in their 90s. They spent the weekend not talking about battles or medals, but about bridges they had built, roads they had carved from nothing, problems they had solved with nothing but ingenuity and determination. When asked what they were most proud of, the consensus was simple: we kept the army moving. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, 101 years old at the time, said something that perhaps captures it all. The Germans thought war was about destroying things. We knew it was about building them. They blew things up. We put them back together. In the end, creation beat destruction. It always does if you're fast enough. The roads are still there. Drive through Europe today and you're traveling on their legacy. Highways that follow routes carved out by bulldozers in 1944. Bridges whose foundations were laid by exhausted engineers working through the night. Intersections that were crossroads of history where American construction met German destruction and won. But the physical infrastructure is just the visible part. The invisible legacy is the knowledge that seemingly impossible tasks can be accomplished, that destruction can be outpaced by construction, that with enough determination and ingenuity, any obstacle can be overcome. The American engineers in Europe didn't just build roads. They built a new understanding of what was possible. In the archives of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, there's a report dated May 10, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender. It's a simple inventory of equipment and materials remaining in Europe. But at the bottom, someone, history doesn't record who, added a handwritten note. We built faster than they could destroy. We won. That's the story that's been forgotten, overshadowed by more dramatic narratives of combat and conquest. But it's perhaps the most important story of all: how a generation of Americans took the impossible task of building across a destroyed continent and made it routine, how they turned construction into a weapon more powerful than any bomb, how they literally paved the way to victory. The final testimony comes from an unexpected source. In 1962, a German veteran named Wilhelm Hoffmann published a memoir in which he wrote, "I have spent 17 years trying to understand how we lost. We had better trained soldiers, superior tactics, defensive advantages. But the Americans had something we didn't understand and couldn't counter. They had the ability to make tomorrow different from today. Every morning, the battlefield was different because they had built something new in the night. They didn't defeat us in battle. They simply built a new world around us, and we found ourselves strangers in it." The roads they built have been repaved many times since 1945. The bridges have been modernized, strengthened, replaced. The original steel matting has long since been recycled into peacetime uses. But if you know where to look, if you know what to listen for, you can still sense their presence. The ghost of bulldozers in the night, the echo of hammers on steel, the rumble of trucks that never stopped moving forward. Stand on a bridge over the Rhine at dawn, when the mist rises from the water, and you might hear it, the sound of American engineers building the impossible, one river crossing at a time. Walk a country road in the Ardennes at dusk, and you might feel it, the vibration of history itself being reshaped by men who refused to accept that anything was impossible. They built faster than destruction itself. They conquered not through violence but through creation. They won a war not by tearing down but by building up. It's a lesson worth remembering, a story worth telling, a legacy worth preserving. Because in the end, that's what they proved in Europe all those years ago, that with enough determination, skill, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat, human beings can build faster than war can destroy. They proved that creation is stronger than destruction, that the urge to connect and construct can overcome the impulse to separate and demolish. The roads are gone now, mostly. Swallowed by 70 years of progress, buried under modern autobahns and shopping centers, forgotten beneath the ordinary traffic of everyday life. But sometimes, in the early morning when the light falls just right, you can see them, the ghost roads of 1944, straight as arrows, cutting across the landscape with American efficiency. And if you listen carefully in the pre-dawn darkness, when the modern world sleeps, you can still hear it, the sound that terrified the German high command and amazed the French civilians. The sound of engines that never stopped. The sound of building that never ceased. The sound of an army that conquered Europe not by destroying it, but by rebuilding it one impossible road at a time. Listen closely. You can still hear the echo of engines racing against time.